All right, people. Today I wanted to share something that I was asked about, and it was not something that I was going to meditate per se today, but that's from this passage, Matthew chapter 21, verse 20. The disciples, you know the story. This is when Jesus cursed a fig tree. You've probably heard so many messages about this. So when the disciples saw the fig tree withering away, all right, Matthew's version says, and seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it, found nothing on it, but only leaves, and he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. It's immediate. What happens is a lot of people have this question: what happened to the fig tree? Was it immediate or was it the next day? Because Mark, if you will go to Mark chapter 11, verse 20 onwards, you see they passed by in the morning the next day. Jesus, before that, you see he goes into the temple and he casts out all those who are selling, and all that narrative comes in between his cursing the fig tree and his disciples noticing this, because it says, as they passed by in the morning the next day, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered. Now, listen, this is Mark we're talking about. Mark got a lot of his source from Peter. So, this is coming straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And, Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Now, this narrative by Mark seems to suggest that the fig tree withered overnight, and it was the next day that the disciples noticed it. But if you go to Matthew, the verse that we were thinking about, it says the fig tree withered at once. And the same thing in verse 20 also, when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? So, presumably, a lot of people feel that there's a discrepancy. Now, not only do people think there is a discrepancy, I've seen people trying to defend this passage and the other passage and try to bring some semblance into it by saying that, the disciples didn't see it and that's why they didn't notice it. They only heard Jesus curse it. And the next day when they came in Mark, they noticed it. But this thing at once was what really happened. The fun part of this is this word at once. I want you to notice this. If you look at this word, it's called parakrema. Parakrema. Now, for those of you who know, whether it's in biology or otherwise also in Little Greek, para means to be at the side or be on the side. Called to help, called beside to help is what parakletos means. From para and kaleo. Kaleo means to call, para means to be beside, and that's why it's interpreted, that verse, as an advocate, because an advocate is someone who's called beside you to help you legally in a case. So para means beside, and the word here is krema. Now, for those of you who want it enlarged so you can see, the word krema is not something that means immediate. Now, if you look at Strong's or some of those dictionaries that a lot of people use, you will find that parakrema means instantaneously, immediately, and all of that. But you look at those words, you see technically parakrema means something useful. So with something useful. Para is with or beside, and krema means something useful. In fact, if you look at the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, it's kind of the gold standard of theological dictionaries that we have. It's not like the Strong's. Strong's is like, the Oxford Pocket Dictionary kind of thing. But this is like volumes and volumes of a dictionary. And so the TD&D, which is kind of a reference book, on an academic level, you look at academic commentaries, they actually take their commentary by using interpretations given in the TD&T and the TDOT in many occasions. So this is a very, very reliable source. The meaning of krema throughout the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, if you take the Old Testament, it's like the bounty or riches from a war. That's how it has been used. You look in the New Testament, you see repeatedly when people brought riches, it is called krema. So krema means a kind of richness. And so if you take para krema in how the word should be, it would mean with all its richness. So when you look at a tree, how do you interpret that richness? You remember the imagery that Jesus brings. He sees the tree lush with leaves, and that lush foliage, with all of the lushness, with all the richness of its leaves and how healthy the tree looked, how amazing the tree looked, in all of its lushness, the tree dried up. So, when I look at that, for you to understand the picture, when you look at a fossil that has been well preserved, a pristine fossil, it doesn't mean that the fossil formed like that in a moment. What it means is that the fossil was preserved very well. As the animal would have looked, we have an image of a fossil. That is the kind of imagery that would be appropriate here, where it says that the fig tree has withered as it was, as is, with all its leaves, with all its grandeur. Now it stands withered to the core. And that's what the disciples are talking about. And so when Jesus talks about this, in Matthew, what we are seeing is the disciples, when the disciples saw it. It's not like the disciples saw that at that point. It's saying when the disciples saw. Now, when did the disciples see it? Mark, getting his material from Peter himself, and Peter is saying that Peter's the one who talked about this. And Peter's narrative includes the cleansing of the temple between the cursing and the commenting by the disciples, or rather Peter himself. There's no way Mark, writing so many years earlier than another gospel like John, and so close to the actual events that transpired between Peter and Jesus, and the fact that Peter himself is the source, and he's the guy who asked Jesus or commented about the withering of the tree, makes it really hard for me to not believe the Markan account that it was the next day that this was observed. And so the only problem with Matthew is when we read Matthew, it feels like it happened in that moment, and the disciples are like, wow, it just happened like that. But that's not what really happened. What happened is the tree in all its lushness, in the thick foliage, as thick as a fig tree can have, in all its grandeur, it dried up because of what Jesus said. Now, it could have happened overnight, and most probably it did happen overnight, because the disciples don't mention anything at that point. Because when the disciples saw it, again, when they saw it, which was the next day, it doesn't say what time it was, they marveled and said, how did the fig tree wither as is? As it stood in its greenery, now it's all dried up. It's entirely dry. It's not like it was fading away slowly. So that's what this is all about. But I want to add one more thing. So this is not a contradiction. It aligns perfectly. When did the fig tree dry up? I believe it's overnight. And the disciples saw that the next morning, according to the Markan narrative, and Matthew does not necessarily contradict it. Our translations decided to go with at once. Now, some of the smaller dictionaries, when you look at it, I feel they give a meaning to a particular word based on, the best interpretation they can have based on the translation. Sometimes that's what it feels like. So when you go to a dictionary like the TD&T, you'll find that looking at krema, looking at para and para krema, it aligns perfectly with the harmony between Matthew and Mark. But one other thing that I wanted to mention, when you look at this thing in most of our sermons, we generally talk about how the fig tree had some problem, and we are supposed to bear fruit for the Lord, and this and that. But if you look at Jesus's lesson from the withering of the fig tree, when the disciples marveled and said, how did the fig tree wither away at once? Jesus doesn't say, unless you repent and bear fruit, you will also wither away. That's not what he says. When, once Herod killed some people who were offering sacrifices or going to offer sacrifice and mix their blood and all that, or, the tower fell, and some people got killed. The lesson Jesus tells is, unless you repent, you will also die. But here he's not saying, learn this from the fig tree that unless you bear fruit, you will also wither away and you will be cursed. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That's not what this passage is about. What Jesus is telling is about faith. He's saying that if you have faith and you do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith. So Jesus' lesson is not, comparing us to the fig tree. He's telling us that anything, whether it is a living object, a living plant or an animal, or an inanimate object like a mountain, faith does move mountains. Faith does wither fig trees. And he's saying anything is possible to you. That's the lesson you should learn, that because of Jesus, we've been privileged to have access to this kind of faith by the Spirit of God. You can look at the fig tree that is not bearing fruit and command it to wither away. You can look at a sickness in your body, command it to wither away. Like the Old Testament says, life and death is in the power of the tongue. And Jesus demonstrated it to its fullness. Jesus did not just fulfill the law as in doing the nice things and not doing the bad things. He also fulfilled the power things that people in the Old Testament did not necessarily fulfill. But let me leave you with this one thought. Your mountain is not hard for God. It is hard to you only until faith rises up. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It is the confidence that comes from your heart. It's not something that you mentally imagine that God will do. It is something that rises from inside your spirit. It's the language of your spirit. You've probably experienced this. And if you have, learn to pray until a confidence rises in you. And then look at the mountains in your life and ask them to move aside. They will move. You will have a way where there was no way. God bless you.